The mind reader tried to break the human, then saw what humanity survived. Administrator Nash slammed the heavy magnetic restraint onto Elias' wrist with a mechanical thud that echoed through the sterile, pressurized air of the central spire. The cold metal bit into Elias' skin, locking his arm to the interrogation table while the administrator leaned in, his breath smelling of synthetic coffee and desperation. "You have until the first atmospheric cycle to confess to the scrubber sabotage," Nash declared, his voice a jagged edge in the quiet room. "If you do not, Kaelith will be authorized to peel your mind apart layer by layer until there is nothing left but the truth." Elias did not flinch, his gaze remaining fixed on the frost patterns crawling across the reinforced viewscreen behind the administrator. He was a man who had spent 40 years learning how to be still, a drifter whose only possession was the silence he kept. He felt the weight of the accusation like a physical burden, but he remained mute, his steady hands resting as comfortably as they could within the magnetic shackles. The door hissed open, admitting Kaelith and her 4 broad-shouldered Xylari sisters into the cramped, industrial habitat module, where Elias was eventually relocated under guard. According to the Law of Communal Grief, his alleged crime was a death of the soul, requiring the presence of an entire household to monitor his decay. The sisters moved with a fluid, silent grace, their cerulean skin glowing softly against the dull gray bulkheads as they began to unpack woven indigo fabrics and meditation mats. Kaelith stood at the center of the chaos, her high-flowing ponytail swaying as she directed her sisters with subtle nods. She looked at Elias with emerald eyes that held a mixture of duty and a deep, ancient haunting. Her bohemian dress, belted tightly over her strong, thick frame, rustled as she stepped toward him. Elias watched them colonize his minimalist living space, his small sanctuary of grease-stained tools and recycled air now filled with the scent of alien spices and the soft chime of silver bangles. Elias did not offer a protest as the Xylari women moved his few belongings to make room for their rituals. Instead, he limped to the small galley and began preparing a meager ration of synth broth, his movements methodical and calm. He poured 5 bowls and set them on the low table, gesturing for the sisters to eat. Kaelith watched him closely, her mind already brushing against the outer edges of his consciousness, but she found herself blocked by a strange, tactile resistance. In his breast pocket, Elias clutched a worn, hand-written list of names, his fingers tracing the ink through the fabric. When Kaelith reached out with a tentative psychic thread, he tightened his grip on the paper, his jaw setting. The initial mental brush was jarring for her. While her people's thoughts were like flowing water or shifting clouds, Elias' mind felt like solid iron, cold and unyielding. She took the bowl of broth from his hand, her fingers briefly touching his scarred skin, and felt a jolt of grounded, physical reality that unsettled her more than any outburst of violence would have. The first formal interrogation began later that evening, the air thick with the hum of the habitat's life support. Kaelith sat across from Elias, her sisters forming a semicircle of silent support behind her, their combined presence amplifying her telepathic reach. She closed her eyes and began to peel, pushing past the surface layers of his immediate thoughts. She expected to find the jagged edges of guilt or the frantic loops of a saboteur's plan. Instead, she was momentarily stunned by the sheer weight of what she encountered. Elias' memories were not fluid. They were heavy, dense, and etched with a profound sense of loss that felt like lead in her mind. She saw the flicker of a dying world, the taste of ash on a tongue that had forgotten the flavor of rain. The intensity of the sensory data made her gasp, her emerald eyes snapping open as she recoiled. It was not the mind of a criminal she was touching, but a living archive of a species that had refused to vanish. As the days passed, domestic life fell into a tense, surreal routine within the small module. Kaelith's sisters, unable to remain idle, began to use their strong arms to help Elias with the upkeep of his quarters, their bangles clinking as they repaired his oil-stained canvas duster. They organized his haphazard collection of wrenches and scrap metal with a precision that bordered on the sacred. Kaelith sat in the corner, watching Elias work on a malfunctioning heater that the station's official maintenance crew had ignored for months. He moved with a quiet, mechanical competence, his hands never shaking despite the death sentence hanging over him. Kaelith found herself drawn to his silence, realizing that his drifter lifestyle was not a lack of purpose, but a shield. She pushed deeper into his mind during their quiet hours, experiencing the first braided timeline flicker, the suffocating dust of a dying Earth, and the deafening roar of the last evacuation ships. He was a carrier of a lost world's legacy, a man who remembered the color of a sky that no longer existed. The relationship shifted one evening after Elias successfully bypassed a faulty relay to restore warmth to the sisters' sleeping area. Kaelith stood by the vent, feeling the rush of heated air, and looked at the man who was supposed to be her prisoner. "Why do you carry that list?" she asked, her voice soft and direct. Elias pulled the paper from his pocket, the edges frayed from years of handling. "These are the people who didn't make it to the ships," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They are the reason I keep the air scrubbers running. I didn't break them, Kaelith." Kaelith felt a wave of clarity that didn't come from her telepathy. She admitted, for the first time, that the Xylari Council had not sent her to find the truth, but to provide a scapegoat. The colony was restless, the oxygen was thinning, and Nash needed a villain to blame for the failing infrastructure. She saw the reflection of her own people's trauma in his eyes, a shared understanding of being a refugee in a cold, uncaring universe. The turning point came during a deep-dive probe intended to find the blueprints for the sabotage. Kaelith pushed too hard, seeking the core of his resilience, and was suddenly pulled into a traumatic humanity feedback loop. It was a psychic riptide of centuries of war, famine, and the desperate, beautiful struggle to survive against impossible odds. The sheer scale of the collective human experience overwhelmed her sensitive Xylari mind, her consciousness fracturing under the weight of 1,000,000,000 ghosts. She collapsed forward, her forehead hitting the table, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Elias did not hesitate. He ignored the magnetic restraint that jerked at his wrist, straining against the metal until his skin bruised, and reached out to catch her. He used his grease-stained hands to anchor her, his physical presence a lighthouse in the storm of her mind. He spoke no words, but the steady beat of his heart and the roughness of his palms grounded her back in the present, pulling her away from the abyss of his people's history. While Kaelith was still recovering in Elias' arms, the station's alarm system began to wail a low, mournful tone. The midpoint reversal was swift and brutal. The real saboteur, acting under Nash's direct orders, had triggered a manual purge of the atmospheric vents in their sector. The administrator intended to kill the witnesses and the scapegoat in one clean sweep. Elias looked at the venting icons flashing red on his wall monitor and knew they had minutes before the oxygen was replaced with nitrogen. "We have to go," he said, his voice cracking the silence. He used a heavy wrench to shatter the magnetic lock on his wrist, the metal sparking as it gave way. He grabbed his canvas duster and the handwritten list, then looked at Kaelith and her 4 sisters. The interrogation was a distraction. Nash is clearing the board. He knew the hazardous, freezing vent tunnels better than anyone on Boreas 9, and he was the only one who could lead them through the labyrinth of the station's underbelly to safety. They moved through the frost-rimed tunnels like ghosts, the air so cold it burned their lungs. Elias led the way, his boots crunching on the thin ice that coated the service catwalks. He used his drifter's intuition to bypass automated security sensors, knowing exactly which wires to bridge and which panels to avoid. Behind him, Kaelith and her sisters moved in a tight formation, their minds linked in a desperate web of concentration. They used their combined mental strength to mask their heat signatures from the thermal hunters Nash had sent into the vents. The silver-threaded patterns on Kaelith's dress shimmered in the dim emergency lighting as she focused her will, shielding them from detection. Elias stopped at a junction, checking his list once more before tucking it away. "These aren't just names of the dead, Kaelith," he whispered as they huddled in the shadows. They are the people who taught me how to fix things, how to hide, and how to keep going. She realized then that his mind wasn't broken. It was a fortress of resilience designed to protect others. They reached a hidden relay station deep within the central spire, where Elias' suspicions were confirmed. He pulled up the internal logs, showing Kaelith the digital trail of Nash's corruption. The administrator had been skimming oxygen profits for years, intentionally sabotaging the scrubbers to justify higher taxes and tighter control over the colonists. Kaelith watched the data stream across the screen, her emerald eyes glowing with a cold, righteous fury. She experienced a profound internal shift, realizing that her culture's tradition of shattering was being used as a tool of suppression by men like Nash. She looked at Elias, the man she was meant to break, and felt a bond that transcended species and law. She chose to defy her obligations to the Xylari Council, deciding that the truth was worth more than the order she had been sworn to protect. They were no longer prisoner and guard. They were survivors with a common enemy. The final ascent to the central spire's transmission array was a blur of steel and shadow. They emerged into the high-ceiling chamber just as Nash's security detail closed in. Elias grabbed a heavy industrial welding torch, the blue flame hissing as he held the line at the main access door. He fought with the desperate, efficient movements of a man who had nothing left to lose, using the tools of his trade to keep the guards at bay. In the center of the room, Kaelith and her sisters stood in a circle, their hands joined, their breathing synchronized. Kaelith reached out and took the handwritten list from Elias' pocket one last time, using it as a psychic lens. She didn't just broadcast the evidence of the sabotage. She broadcasted Elias' memories. She sent the weight of human endurance, the grit of the dying earth, and the unyielding will to survive into every mind on Boreas 9 simultaneously. The colony staggered under the collective realization. Thousands of people felt the cold of the evacuation ships and the heat of Elias' fire. They saw Nash's face through the eyes of a man who had been framed, and they felt the administrator's greed as a physical sickness. The telepathic shout was so powerful that the guards dropped their weapons, overwhelmed by the shared grief and the sudden, sharp clarity of the truth. Nash, standing on the command deck, fell to his knees as the weight of his own crimes was reflected back at him by the entire population. The uprising was silent but absolute. There was no need for a trial when everyone already knew the verdict. The magnetic restraints on the colony's soul were shattered by a single human's memory and an alien woman's courage to share it. In the aftermath, the death of the soul sentence was formally lifted, but the world had changed too much for a simple return to the status quo. Elias and Kaelith stood on the exterior gantry of Boreas 9, far above the frozen plains. The station was quiet now, the air scrubbers humming with a new, honest rhythm. They sat together on the cold metal grating, their shoulders touching. Kaelith's cerulean skin looked pale in the light of the distant stars, and her emerald eyes were fixed on the horizon. Elias held the list of names in his lap, the paper finally still. They were both permanently changed, their minds braided together by the memories they had survived. As the first true thaw of the planet began, a single drop of meltwater fell from the atmospheric spire, landing on Elias' hand. They watched the frost begin to recede from the metal, a slow, golden warmth spreading across the world as they sat together in the silence of a new beginning.